This video will provide an introduction to Old Testament archaeology. Here are the 5 points that we'll be examining. First, what is archaeology? And then, what is the aim and what are the limits involved in archaeology? Who got it started? What about the terms minimalist and maximalist? What do these refer to? And finally, how do archaeologists go about their work? Primary sources that I'm using for this lecture are visible here. First off, what is archaeology? The field of archaeology involves exploring ancient architecture and artifacts. Architecture, the evidence of the layout of a building. Artifacts, particular elements of material culture that relate to use in daily life, whether made of ceramic or metal or stone or even remains of humans or animals. Architecture we find in villages and cities. You'll find the villages referred to as a tell, with one L in Arabic, two L's in Hebrew. It means a mound. You'll also find some of these sites referred to as a kirbeh or kirbet. And this is a word meaning a ruin. What distinguishes a mound from simply a natural hill in the topography is that its sides tend to be steeper, and there's evidence that it has been human construction. It's not simply and strictly a natural mound. Perhaps there is a bit of a mound at its base, the bedrock of it, but then human habitation has added to it, and the sides tend to be a little steeper. For an example of a tell or a mound, please notice this mound at Beth Shean. We're focusing on the raised portion at the rear of the photo, not the Roman ruin, which is considerably later, that's in the foreground. The raised portion at the back intersects with some of the story of the death of King Saul. To get a notion of where this is located within Israel, you'll notice that it's in the Jordan Valley, there between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, roughly where the Jezreel Valley intersects the Jordan Valley, Jezreel Valley, coming in from the northwest. As far as locating artifacts, those might be found, and especially in concentration, are found in those villages, but they could be located in the wilderness, or marine excavation finds shipwrecks and material under the sea. Among artifacts, we want to distinguish between epigraphic, that is, artifacts that have a written message on them, over against non-epigraphic artifacts, such as a fragment of pottery that may have nothing written on it. Let's turn to the question of the aim of archaeology and its limits. You can see a statement from the volume by Fritz indicating the aim of archaeology. The task is exploration of the history and the culture of Palestine. The history, what are the events that transpired? Culture looks a little more deeply as far as the texture of life. How was life lived then? What did they use for illumination? What did they use for cosmetics? What were weapons like? Things that simply a written report of history might overlook. So archaeology seeks to, in a sense, fill in the gaps in this fashion. We want to point out that the aim of archaeology is neither to prove or disprove the Bible, but rather to give us an enriched read of the Bible. As Price has indicated, archaeology can't prove the Bible, it can only confirm it. As regards the limits of archaeology, it's important to realize that discovery of particular artifacts or uncovering of architecture is a matter of chance. Price estimates that if we were to talk about total recovery of what happened during an era as 100%, he estimates that some 96% of the information that we might recover has been destroyed, whether through human habitation of earlier areas that dismantled houses or destroyed implements, or through war, or through fires or flood, natural disasters. I hope this helps you realize that the notion of trying to conclusively prove the Bible would be, from archaeology and the finds, would be an insurmountable task, because we would be trying to prove, in essence, 100% of events with only 4% of recoverable data. So what has been preserved is fragmentary, bits and pieces, and what has been discovered of what has been preserved is just occurring by chance. In other words, there's a lot more that can be discovered. It's still buried. But what does turn up is a chance discovery based on where the archaeologists decide to do their research. So it should not surprise you that most of the information that we will recover through archaeology will inform background knowledge about daily life. You can see bulleted a sample list of the kinds of information that we might gain from archaeological artifacts or architecture that's uncovered. Now, on rare occasion, we will find artifacts that we link clearly to specific persons or events in history, events recorded in the biblical account. Sometimes that derives from non-epigraphic discoveries, and here we're talking about discoveries that do not have an inscription. There is no written message. If you're wondering what that might entail, it could be a destruction layer in a city. There are some cities where archaeologists dig down stratum after stratum, and then they come to a burn layer where it's clear that this village or city has been destroyed by fire. That can be a datable event. If there are other elements around, sometimes that can be datable to something we know from the biblical account. In addition, there are some discoveries where there is an epigraphic artifact, an artifact with a written message. And we are able, by reading, by deciphering, decoding that, we're able to tell what individual or what historic event is being referred to. Or sometimes it's an ownership. Such and such a vessel belongs to some figure that we know from biblical record. So in those instances, they are exceptional. We're able to correlate an artifact to a specific person or an event. The next couple of slides will show you one sample of datable archaeological recovery that dates to 701 BC. And that's when the Assyrian Sennacherib was attacking areas further west of him in the Levant, in particular Palestine and Israel. And the fortified cities around Jerusalem formed one of the targets of his attack. Here you can see the location of Jerusalem and also the location of Lachish, which was one of the fortified cities that ringed around Jerusalem. What you're looking at now is a wall relief. This is a pretty substantial size to give you a notion of the dimension. If we were to show the full, what you're looking at right now is a detail, but this is part of a relief that stretches probably about 5 or 6 feet tall, and the entire scene's, I suppose it runs 15, maybe 20 feet long. So it's quite a mural. Where was it located? This was not uncovered in Israel, not in Palestine, but it was uncovered in Nineveh, in Sennacherib's palace. So after his campaign, part of which happened in 701, it was a longer campaign, but part of which in 701, he went back home and he memorialized, he wanted to record his triumphs, part of which was the siege of an Israelite city, the city of Lachish. There were several cities around Jerusalem that the monarchy had especially fortified in order to create a defense ring, in essence, to make it harder for attackers to reach Jerusalem unscathed. Lachish is one of the cities that Sennacherib laid siege to. Let me just point out some features that when you first see this mural, it's kind of stylized and hard to make sense of. So notice, for example, the sloping brickwork. If you look at it, it looks like a series of bamboo poles, but actually it's intending to indicate an artificial ramp, a man-made ramp. What's the ramp? It's called a siege ramp. It's in order for the troops to be able to get up to the walls. On that ramp, you see this particular machine. This is a siege engine. You see wheels on the bottom of it. You see a probe that's reaching out in front, a ram, so to be able to apply pressure to the wall and damage it. You see some of these soldiers. These are Assyrians with the headdress that are inside. We got an archer here. This chap, incidentally, he has got his hands on a handle, the far end of which looks like an inverted bowl, and then you see what appears to be spaghetti coming down. That's a representation of water. Why would you want to keep a siege engine wet? Well, it's made of animal skins. Yeah, it's covered over, I should say, with animal skins, and here you can see how the skins have been stitched together or looped together. This is an incredible degree of detail. Why they want to keep it wet is because incendiaries are being thrown down by the people in Lachish, the warriors in Lachish, from the top of the walls in order to repel, ignite, and repel them. There is an incendiary. Let's see if we can indicate it right. Here we go. Here's an incendiary. It looks like a kind of a frayed. It looks like a torpedo with a fray, a fragment, fabric fray. But actually, this is indicating fire. There's another one, a larger one that's on top. You see the fraying here. That's to indicate fire. So these are incendiaries that are being thrown down, and the water is there to try and help the siege engine be able to sustain the attack. Also on this screen, we're able to see where the walls are. This territory here represents the Lachish walls. You can see the vertical smooth surfaces. Looks like some kind of windows here. It's rather eroded at the top, but these appear to be something of shields. These would be actual defending warriors here at the top. So once again, we're talking about an archaeologically recovered artifact, this one not in Israel, but back in Nineveh, but reporting an event, a warfare event that took place in Israel. And we're able to locate it in time, locate it in space as far as what it's reporting. That's the Siege of Lachish. Here's part of that same mural. Quite a different scene, isn't it? Notice these figures. We have a series of figures on the left who are directing their attention in a very humble fashion, some of them kneeling. This gentleman up here basically prostrating himself, getting down quite low. Notice the hair, the headdress pattern. You have kind of a tightly knotted, sort of curled hair and beard. Contrast that now with some of the other figures that we see here. Contrast that with this fellow, for example. He is one of the warrior attendants of Sennacherib, whereas the others, this is representing Israelites doing obeisance, presenting themselves to Sennacherib, who is the warrior who has conquered Lachish. If you're familiar with that story, he was not successful in conquering the capital, Jerusalem. God protected them, but he did overwhelm several of the surrounding areas. Sennacherib himself is represented here sitting on a really ornate and carved throne. Notice the figures that are carved into this raised throne. Even there's a footstool, so he's in a very honored position. Now let's give a brief overview concerning the pioneers of archaeological exploration. We'll begin as far back as the 1500s by acknowledging that Pietro della Valle discovered bricks with the wedge-shaped inscription cuneiform that had not yet been deciphered. Found them in the mounds of Babylon. If you look at the map on the right, the actual ancient region of Babylon is between the large print Akkad and Babylonian in the Mesopotamian Valley. Roughly 3 centuries later, Heinrich Schliemann was intrigued by the tales of Troy in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and he undertook to try and locate that. It doesn't show on this map, but if you were to be in the upper left corner, which is Turkey, and take it right out to the Dardanelles, that pinched channel, it's at the southern edge of the Dardanelles. That's where he located Troy in western Turkey. Also in the 1800s, Sir Henry Rawlinson was stationed in Baghdad. You can see that on the map just above the large print word Akkad. And he engaged some preliminary exploration there. Sir Leonard Woolley is famous for exploring Ur of the Chaldees. You'll see that located below the capital letters Sumer. And then both Austin Henry Layard of England and Paul-Émile Botta of France explored Nimrud and Khorsabad. Now, in order to locate Nimrud, go upstream of the Tigris, and you'll see the town of Mosul, the modern town of Mosul, below the capital letters of Assyria. Nimrud is located 30 kilometers south of Mosul, whereas Khorsabad is 15 kilometers northeast of Mosul. What's important about these is they are capitals associated with Ashur-Nasirpal and Sargon II Assyrians. So, Layard and Botta were involved in these explorations. Botta, again, is from France. Consequently, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, you will find these massive what are called Lamassu bowls from the Khorsabad Palace. That was exploration in Mesopotamia. Turn now to Egypt. Famous there was the explorations of Giovanni Belzoni, a fascinating character. He was an engineer by trade, also worked in a circus as a strongman. When he was in Egypt, he was fascinated by the opportunity to recover artifacts. Some of his methods were rather cavalier. Regions where he operated included the Valley of the Kings and the Giza Pyramids. When the French under Napoleon established control in Egypt, that is when the famous Rosetta Stone was uncovered, which was so instrumental in deciphering hieroglyphic. Notice the dimensions that are listed here on the screen, about 42 inches high, 29 inches wide, and then the thickness of the stone is about 11 inches. Oftentimes when we simply look at a photo, if we don't have a frame of reference, we can't appreciate how small, or in this case, how large it is. The Rosetta Stone is currently housed in the British Museum. Coming to the territory of Israel proper, in the early 1800s, Edward Robinson, along with an assistant, Eli Smith, undertook to recover place names. So it's not so much artifacts, but noticing regions of ancient habitation, tells or mounds, or the kirba, the ruins, worked to establish a correlation between those sites and the names, the ancient names. This was published in the three-volume work that you see listed here, Biblical Researches in Palestine. Robinson, if you're familiar at all with Jerusalem archaeology, there is a particular arch that he recovered. Now, this dates much later than Old Testament archaeology. It's more in the Second Temple era. But there is a protrusion from the existing wall that is the retaining wall for the temple plaza proper. You can see it in the picture on the left. On the right, you see an artist's reconstruction. The protruding part would correspond to what's directly below the exposed pillars, the pillars that lead into something of a covered courtyard. Robinson's Arch bears the name of this archaeologist. Continuing with pioneer archaeologists in Israel, a very famous individual is William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Sir Petrie, working along with Frederick Jones Bliss. The contribution of Petrie runs like this. He had a background from already engaging archaeology in Egypt. And then he arrived at Tel el-Hesi, which is in southern Palestine. If you wish to locate it, you would want to find the city of Gaza, which is on the coast, the southwestern, the Mediterranean coast of Palestine. Tel el-Hesi is near there. At that site, as he began peeling away the layers, he noticed that there was the imposition of various layers of living. So he was cashing in on discoveries that Schliemann had made when he was exploring Troy, and also some of his work in Greece. So Flinders Petrie, instead of just doing surface exploration, looking for artifacts that were poking up through the sands, as it were, he began to peel the layers away and realized that we had successive layers of habitation. The other contribution that Petrie especially initiated for Palestine was establishing relative dating. So as he uncovers a certain artifact, fragment of pottery, he is noticing the shape and the characteristic of the pottery and how it differs from what was in later layers that would have been higher, and how it will differ from earlier layers that he has yet to excavate, and consequently is able to establish a layer with cohesive dating, relative dating, differentiating between earlier material and later material. We use the term relative dating in contrast to absolute or chronometric dating. When we talk about absolute dating, we're reaching outside of a given site and we're saying this artifact relates to a certain year in an external calendar. Relative dating is not externally related, although sometimes if you find something like a coin or an inscribed piece, then you're able to establish a link with a layer and absolute dating. We've already discussed the differences in the shapes and decoration of pottery and the skill of composition or formation of it. This attention is known as pottery typology. This is something that Flinders Petrie initiated and developed. This display that comes from the Israel Museum helps us appreciate how the typology can be recognized or established. To orient you, notice on the far left, the very bottom column of the far left column, we have Chalcolithic age. So there, that's reaching back to around 4000 BC, and then climbing up, as it were, accumulating layers, one layer upon the other, reaching to the top, the Byzantine in the AD or current era, the CE. As far as what's located in the groupings, the vertical groupings, notice that just to the right of those historical eras, we have some open dishes or bowls. So those are fairly similar, and as you move up layer by layer, then you can notice what elements of these particular pottery items have changed. perhaps even easier to notice the differences would be if we move to the far right. So just inside the column that has the Hebrew language listing of the eras, we have some little figures. These are lamps. So in the very upper right corner, in the Byzantine period, you have a decorated lamp. You have the vertical view and then the horizontal view. One layer earlier would be the Roman period. You have the vertical view, the top view, and then the horizontal view of this small lamp. Some of the other videos that you'll view, the lectures that you'll view associated with this course, will give you a close and realistic view, not just sketches, but actually looking at lamps in the Flora Archaeological collection. The point right now is to let your eye scan all the way down to the early bronze example, the sketch of a lamp. You can see that it's fairly simple in its construction. Just an open dish with a little bit of 4 indentations on the side. This is what we mean as we talk about pottery typology. We're looking for artifacts that had similar usage, like all of these, acknowledging that all of these were lamps, but then noticing how the shape of them and the degree of refinement changes over time. By observing these, then we're able to establish that a given artifact was sourced at a particular era. Continuing on then with the personalities, the individuals that pioneered archaeology in particularly the Palestine zone. Here's a rapid listing of some names, several of which we'll be revisiting as the course progresses, but I just want you to get a snapshot ahead of time. William Foxwell Albright is very famous. He was based at Johns Hopkins University, and you might call him the dean of American biblical archaeology. American, we're distinguishing it from individuals like Sir William Flinders Petrie, who was British. Albright operated at several places. He was famous for his work at Tel Beit Mirsim. And notice that he took what Petrie began to develop in recognition of pottery typology and then refined it. George Ernest Wright knows that he was a student of William Foxwell Albright, so you'll notice kind of a genealogy, as it were, within several of the connections from a teacher to then a student. George Ernest Wright then became famous in his own right. You can see some of the sites where he operated. And among his students were William Dever, Joseph Sager, John Holliday, and these excavated in Israel at the Gezer site. You'll run into some of these later in the course. Benjamin Mazar worked with Albright, so he was associated with him at Tel Beit Mirsim, and then as an Israeli archaeologist proceeded to operate at many Israeli excavations. Another Israeli archaeologist, Avram Biram, was a student of Albright, and he's famous for his work at Tel Dan in the north. Yohanan Aharoni was in turn a student of Mazar, and you can see the locations where he was most famous for operating. Another major name among Israeli archaeologists is Yigael Yadin. He operated at Hatzor, at Megiddo, and Masada. Before leaving our brief snapshot of famous individuals involved in early days of archaeology, we want to go back to British involvement and point out the role of Dame Kathleen Kenyon. She concentrated on Jericho. She's known for the Wheeler-Kenyon method of excavation. This contrasts the Reisner-Fisher method. The Reisner-Fisher said, as we begin to peel away the layers, as soon as we come to something like a wall, what might have been the border of a home or a city wall, we want to trace that wall out as far as we can and just peel away material, making the attention to architecture, the exposed wall, our main goal. Let's figure out how far that city wall went, or where the how the domestic wall turned a corner, then we'll excavate to follow it that way. So that became the dominating feature. For a large structure like a palace, then, this would mean, in essence, clear-cutting, in a sense, peeling away everything across a plaza or across the foundation structure of a large municipal building. In the process, archaeologists realized in retrospect that they were losing a vertical record, and that's what the Wheeler-Kenyon method sought to preserve and change. So what you're looking at is a picture I located on the web showing a site with real good illustration of the Wheeler-Kenyon method. From the top, it looks like a massive waffle. You have these ridges in a grid pattern, and then you have some excavation within them. A novice looking at this might think that the waffle pattern ridges, the retained ridges, are an ancient wall. They are not. They are simply a superimposed grid where the archaeologists say, let's be sure and leave this portion intact, these grid patterns. This allows people to establish quadrants. So if you discover a pot or a domestic wall that's, for example, in the foreground square, these tend to be 5 meter by 5 meter. Sometimes they're 10 meter by 10 meter rectangles, composing multiple rectangles composing the grid, the composite grid. They're able to say, okay, that would be quadrant or grid section 1, and any artifact that is excavated from there, it's labeled as belonging to grid section 1. Not only the grid section, but also the layer. And by retaining these vertical walls, these artificial walls, as it were, retaining them, they're able to notice the strata. It preserves a record of the strata, and that helps orient then any particular artifacts or architecture that is discovered. Of course, if there's artifacts that are discovered, they're removed from their source site. And if there is architecture on, say, third level down, and you keep going to the 4th or the 5th level further down, you're going to be dismantling the architecture. So it's not retained, but it would be, the remnants of it would be retained in the artificial walls. They're called balks, spelled either B-A-L-K or B-A-U-L-K. So that is characteristic of the Wheeler-Kenyon method. Dame Kathleen Kenyon, Brit, operating especially in Jericho. We're turning now from that brief overview of pioneers in archaeology to address the question, what's the difference between a minimalist and a maximalist? This is a bit of specialized lingo or jargon within the field of biblical studies. Notice the quote by Price, Randall Price, on page 20 in his book on archaeology. He writes, minimalists are those who minimalize the biblical data in deference to the archaeological data. So it runs like this. If you have a biblical account, say the account of Joseph, that says at a particular period of time there was Joseph, and he grew up in such and such a family, and he was kidnapped, sold into enslavement in Egypt, and rose to become something like a prime minister, a vizier in Egypt, that would be biblical data. Do we have archaeological data? Do we have records from Egypt? To my knowledge, not yet. We haven't recovered anything that says clearly, here is the Joseph of biblical record. A minimalist would say, well, it's very nice that we have a biblical record, but until someone produces archaeological data, I don't regard the biblical data as trustworthy. That's the view of a minimalist. Maximalist takes the opposite view, somewhat opposite, and says the Bible and the record found there has and contributes trustworthy information like any ancient document. Now, some maximalists will ascribe and recognize the scripture as having inspired trustworthiness, and other maximalists may not. But the idea is the biblical record is not presumed to be unreliable until corroborated by external evidence, extra biblical evidence, such as archaeology, but rather it's given at least equal authority as an ancient text. This, in my opinion, and represents, the maximalist view represents more of an even-handed treatment of the biblical material. Instead of being prejudiced against it, it allows it to speak with a comparable voice. If you're interested in an Egyptologist who addresses the issue of fair treatment of the biblical record from a secular, just a scholarly viewpoint, notice the writings of Kenneth Kitchen. Kenneth Kitchen does a nice job of this. He is trained as an Egyptologist, and he takes to task some of those in biblical scholarship who would basically ask the biblical record to wait its turn and put it at the end of the line, not trusting it until archaeological or other kind of extra biblical evidence may be produced to corroborate biblical evidence. Again, that scholar is Kenneth Kitchen. The last item in this lecture that we want to address is a snapshot of how an archaeologist actually goes about his or her work. And I'm driving this from the Fritz volume, pages 52 to 67. Initially, an archaeologist wants to approach a piece of territory with a sense that a given location is going to have a high likelihood of producing artifacts and architecture that are of interest. So, as you figured out so far, that in the Middle East, that means watching for a mound known as a tell. And then moving forward by imposing on that tell a grid, setting out stakes and lines to preserve these walls, these balks that would be retained, and then beginning excavation within those generally 5-meter square grid sections, like an enormous waffle. As the excavation progresses, here's what they're watching for. Do they see stones that seem to be in a given pattern and structured in such a way as to represent an ancient wall or a foundation? In addition, they'll be watching for artifacts, little things protruding through the soil that may be bits of pottery, figurines, implements of various sorts. They're also on the lookout for remains of humans, of animals, of plants. And then, in general, they're watching as they dig down to be attentive to differentiation, demarcation from one stratum to another. One of the best ways that most reliable ways of determining this is if they come to a floor. So there would be, within perhaps a habitation, there would be packed earth. It would be a little more dense. And that can indicate then, as you might reasonably expect, that that's where a given habitation period would have concluded. You'd dig down through that floor, you'd be reaching into initially the fill or debris that was brought in on top of an earlier stratum. Very important in the process of excavation, then, letter D is to be sure to document what they've found. And this consists of a combination of diaries and sketches and photographs, making sure each artifact is labeled according to its locus number, where in the find, what grid, and also how far down, what depth, what stratum was it excavated from. When that's properly recorded, then those items can be removed and taken for scientific analysis. And some artifacts are more inclined to yield information through analysis than others. Finally, it's important that the discoveries would be disseminated through publication. You may see references to a campaign. Campaign refers to a particular season or year within a series of excavations. So if Dame Kenyon operated in Jericho for 4 or 5 years, there would be a 4 or 5 separate campaigns or seasonal reports. This is based on the fact that as you get into certain seasons, the inclement weather prevents the excavation from continuing, so they would suspend it and then come back months later and pick up where they left off. Campaign or seasonal excavation reports are the most granular or gritty reports of the discoveries. There would tend to be less synthesis, and it certainly would have less bridging from one site, one tell to another. It would be focused right on that tell, so it's fairly narrow. It provides a fairly granular description of what was uncovered during the weeks or months of a given excavation.
By way of review, in this initial video, we've gotten a sense of what archaeology is, what it aims to achieve, and what it cannot achieve. Who are some of the main figures in the development of the science of archaeology? What's the difference between a minimalist and a maximalist? And the steps that archaeologists go through as they execute their projects.